I never expected to fall for someone half my age, or for him to see me as anything more than a landlord. But then again, I never expected to feel this alive either. The pen hovered briefly over the lease agreement before I signed my name with steady strokes, the ink leaving behind a mark that felt heavier than it should have. Across the table sat Leo, his casual confidence radiating in waves. So different from the carefully curated reserve I built around myself over years of adulthood. His smile was disarming, too easy, too warm, as he thanked me for renting out the spare room. "You won't regret this," he said, his voice carrying a playful certainty that made my chest tighten just slightly. When we stepped into the loft together, I couldn't help but notice how his presence seemed to fill spaces I hadn't realized were empty. His guitar case leaned against the wall by the door almost immediately, and within hours, soft chords drifted through the apartment, mingling with the hum of city life outside. It wasn't just the music, it was him. The way he laughed at something on his phone or absent-mindedly tapped rhythms on every surface he passed. There was an energy about him, raw and unfiltered, that clashed beautifully with the quiet order I'd always kept. At first, I told myself it was harmless fascination. After all, what was there not to admire? He was young, yes, but also talented and refreshingly unapologetic about who he was. Yet as days turned into weeks, I found myself lingering longer than necessary when he played his guitar late at night, pretending to read while stealing glances at his focused expression under lamplight. His laughter became a constant soundtrack to evenings I used to spend alone, folding laundry or scrolling aimlessly through emails. There was no denying the tension between us, an invisible pull neither of us acknowledged outright. His casual comments about art pieces scattered around the loft, "This one feels like longing," he once mused, caught me off guard, forcing me to see my own space through new eyes. And then there were moments when our paths crossed unexpectedly, a brush of hands reaching for the same mug, a shared glance that lasted a beat too long, and I felt something shift beneath the surface, unsettling yet exhilarating. For the first time in years, I felt awake, alive, which terrified me almost as much as it thrilled me, because whatever this was between us, it wasn't supposed to happen. Not with someone like him. Not now. At first, I was determined to keep things professional. After all, Leo was my tenant, and there were rules, unspoken but firmly ingrained, that governed these kinds of relationships. The age gap alone should have been enough to deter me, not to mention the vows I'd made to Richard years ago. But Leo had a way of slipping past my defenses, his charm as disarming as it was unexpected. He noticed everything, the way I arranged art pieces in the loft, the books stacked neatly on my shelves, and he wasn't shy about complimenting them. "You've got an eye for detail," he said one afternoon, leaning against the doorway to my office. "It's like every piece here has its own story." His words caught me off guard. No one had paid that kind of attention to my work in years. When he asked thoughtful questions about my career or shared stories of his struggles as a musician, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't anticipated. Each conversation felt less transactional and more personal, blurring the line between landlord and tenant until I could barely remember where one ended and the other began. Then came the night of the power outage, a moment that changed everything. The lights flickered and died just as I was settling into bed with a book. Frustrated, I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs, only to find Leo already lighting candles in the living room. He was shirtless, his skin glowing softly in the flickering light, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. "Hey," he said, glancing up with a smile that seemed both casual and knowing. "Figured we might as well make the best of it." I hesitated, clutching the flashlight awkwardly. "What are you doing?" "Setting the mood," he joked, gesturing toward the small constellation of candles scattered around the room. Then, more seriously, "Care to join me? It's kind of nice out here." Against my better judgment, I sat down across from him. The air felt charged, electric, as if the darkness outside had stripped away any pretense we'd been clinging to. We talked for hours about our dreams, regrets, fears. He spoke candidly about the pressure he felt to succeed as a musician, the weight of expectations from people who doubted him. I told him about my marriage, though sparingly, admitting how lonely I'd felt lately without going into specifics. There was something raw and honest about that conversation, something neither of us had allowed ourselves before. In the candlelight, surrounded by shadows, we weren't just landlord and tenant anymore. We were two people sharing parts of ourselves we kept hidden, finding common ground despite our differences. By the time the power came back on, everything had shifted. Our connection deepened, becoming something neither of us could or wanted to ignore. And though I tried to convince myself nothing would come of it, the seed had already been planted. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, with Richard away on yet another business trip. It wasn't the first time I'd found myself pacing the loft alone, but tonight felt different. Restless, charged with an energy I couldn't quite name. That's when I noticed the faint drip from the kitchen faucet, a sound that usually would have annoyed me, but now seemed like a convenient excuse to knock on Leo's door. "Hey," I said as he opened it, trying to sound casual despite the nervous flutter in my chest. "Sorry to bother you, but there's this leaky faucet situation." He smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "A leaky faucet? Sounds serious." "It is," I shot back, feigning irritation, though his grin made it hard not to smile. "Besides, aren't tenants supposed to earn their keep?" His laugh was warm, inviting, and before I knew it, we were standing in the kitchen together, his sleeves rolled up as he examined the sink. The playful banter flowed easily between us, each word pulling us closer until the air buzzed with something neither of us could ignore anymore. When his hand brushed mine while reaching for the wrench, the spark was electric and undeniable. "What are we doing, Claire?" he asked softly, his gaze locking onto mine. I didn't answer, not with words. Anyway, instead, I stepped closer, closing the gap between us. The moment our lips met, everything shifted. Every hesitation, every doubt melted away under the heat of our connection. But as quickly as the exhilaration came, so did the guilt. This wasn't just wrong, it was betrayal. Yet, even knowing that, I couldn't stop. As days turned into weeks, our encounters grew more frequent, each one leaving me torn between shame over my vows and the intoxicating rush of feeling alive again. Leo saw through my conflicted exterior, pushing me gently but firmly to confront what I'd been avoiding for years. "You deserve more than just existing," he told me one night, his voice low and earnest. "Don't settle for less when you could have everything." His words struck deep, forcing me to question whether my marriage had ever truly been fulfilling or if I'd simply stayed because it was safe. Was I clinging to Richard out of love or fear? And what kind of life was I sacrificing by refusing to take a chance on something real? With Leo, I felt seen in ways I hadn't allowed myself to be in years. He pushed boundaries I didn't know I needed broken, urging me toward a truth I buried beneath layers of obligation and routine. But every step forward came at a cost, a little more guilt, a little more risk. Still, no matter how much I tried to resist, I couldn't deny the pull between us. Whatever this was, it wasn't going away anytime soon. Every moment with Leo felt like stealing fire from the gods. Dangerous, intoxicating, and impossible to resist. Yet with each stolen glance, each whispered conversation, the weight of my betrayal grew heavier. Richard had been my rock, once, the man I vowed to stand by through thick and thin. Now, I could barely look him in the eye without feeling the guilt clawing at me. How had it come to this? How had I let myself become someone who hid sandalwood-scented secrets behind closed doors? The signs of suspicion were subtle at first. A lingering glance when he caught me smiling at nothing in particular, a furrowed brow as he noticed the faint trace of cologne that clung to the air after Leo left a room. "You've been different lately," Richard said one evening, his tone measured but probing. "Is everything okay?" I nodded quickly, brushing off his concern with some excuse about work stress, but inside, I was unraveling. He wasn't wrong. I was different. Leo had awakened something in me, a vitality I hadn't felt in years. It was exhilarating and terrifying. At night, alone in bed, I replayed every interaction with Leo, dissecting them for answers I didn't want to find. Was I using him as an escape, a way to avoid confronting the cracks in my marriage? Or was this something real, a connection worth risking everything for? The questions haunted me, twisting into knots I couldn't untangle. Every time I resolved to end things to protect Richard, myself, and whatever shreds of decency I had left, Leo would say or do something that pulled me back in. His unwavering belief in us was magnetic, intoxicating. "We're not just doing this because we can," he told me once, his voice low and earnest. "We're doing it because we have to, because what we feel is too big to ignore." And maybe he was right. Maybe what we shared wasn't just recklessness or rebellion, it was something deeper, something neither of us could walk away from. But how could I justify betraying Richard, the man who had stood by me even when I stopped seeing him? The guilt gnawed at me, relentless and suffocating. I was playing a dangerous game, risking not only my marriage, but also my reputation, my self-respect. Friends, colleagues, they'd all judge me if they knew. And yet, despite the shame, despite the fear, I couldn't bring myself to let go of Leo. It wasn't just the passion, though that burned brighter than anything I'd known. It was the way he made me feel seen, understood, alive. For the first time in years, I wasn't just existing, I was living. And maybe that's why I kept going back, even as the guilt threatened to consume me. Because deep down, I didn't know how to give up the spark Leo had ignited, or if I even wanted to. The tension between Leo and me had reached a fever pitch, each stolen moment crackling with an intensity that left me breathless. That night, the loft was quiet, Richard's absence stretching longer than usual due to yet another business trip. We thought we were safe, untouchable even, as Leo's fingers traced mine in the dim light of the living room. His voice was low but urgent when he whispered my name, pulling me closer as if the world outside no longer existed. But then, the front door clicked open. Time seemed to freeze as Richard stepped inside, his silhouette sharp against the hallway light. For a moment, none of us moved. He stood there, stunned, while Leo and I sprang apart like startled animals. The air turned electric, charged with betrayal and disbelief. Richard's eyes darted between us, wide with shock before narrowing into something darker. Anger, hurt, maybe both. "What the hell is this?" Richard demanded, his voice cutting through the silence like glass shattering. He dropped his briefcase by the door, stepping further into the room. "Claire, is this some kind of joke?" I opened my mouth to respond, but words failed me. Instead, it was Leo who spoke first, his tone steady despite the storm brewing around us. "This isn't what you think," he said firmly, stepping forward. "It's not just some fling. What we have, it's real. Real." Richard spat, his laugh bitter and hollow. "You're telling me throwing away years of marriage for him is real? Jesus, Claire. Stability, trust, all of it gone because you couldn't keep your hands off someone half your age?" His words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they cut too close to the truth I'd been avoiding. This wasn't just about passion or rebellion, it was about choices. And now I had to make one. "I can't do this anymore," I said finally, my voice trembling but resolute. "I can't live two separate lives, pretending everything's fine while keeping parts of myself locked away." My gaze flickered to Richard, pain etched across his face, then back to Leo, whose expression softened with hope. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though the apology felt inadequate. Richard stared at me, his jaw clenched tight. "Fine," he said coldly. "If that's how you feel, don't bother coming back." And just like that, the life I'd known unraveled. Friends took sides, some siding with Richard's outrage, others whispering behind my back about recklessness and selfishness. Shame gnawed at me, but so did liberation. A strange, exhilarating freedom from the constraints I hadn't realized held me down. As Leo and I packed up my things and prepared to leave the loft, I knew the road ahead would be messy, uncertain, but for the first time in years, I felt alive and ready to face whatever came next. Moving in with Leo felt like stepping into uncharted territory. A smaller apartment, fewer luxuries, but a life that seemed more alive than anything I'd known in years. The walls were bare at first, waiting for us to fill them with pieces of ourselves. His guitar leaned against the corner of the living room, its presence both comforting and daunting. It symbolized everything Leo was: passionate, untamed, unapologetically himself. And yet, as we unpacked boxes and arranged furniture, questions lingered beneath the surface, questions I wasn't sure I wanted answers to. Was our love built on genuine connection or rebellion? Was I running towards something real or simply escaping what I'd left behind? These doubts gnawed at me late at night when the city outside grew quiet and all I could hear was the faint hum of distant traffic. Leo slept beside me, his breathing steady and calm, while my mind raced. Had I made the right choice leaving Richard, or had I let infatuation cloud my judgment? The guilt still lingered, a shadow I couldn't shake no matter how much I tried to convince myself this was where I belonged. Leo's passion inspired me in ways I hadn't anticipated. He encouraged me to take risks I'd never dared before, curating experimental art shows, collaborating with emerging artists whose work pulsed with raw emotion. "You're meant for more than just playing it safe," he told me one evening as we sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by sketches and photographs for an upcoming exhibit. His belief in me was intoxicating, but it also forced me to confront parts of myself I'd buried long ago. Was I doing this because it was truly who I was, or because it was easier than facing the consequences of my choices? The challenges of blending our lives weren't insignificant. Our routines clashed sometimes. His spontaneity grated against my need for structure. Yet there were moments when it felt perfect, like finding a rhythm neither of us had known we were missing. We cooked dinner together, danced barefoot in the kitchen, laughed until our sides ached. But even in those moments, doubt crept in. Would this last? Could it? Or were we building something fragile, destined to crumble under the weight of reality? Meanwhile, Richard began piecing his life back together, or so it seemed from the occasional updates he sent. A new project at work, mutual acquaintances asking about me. Each message carried a hint of unresolved feelings, a reminder of the life I'd walked away from. Once he wrote, "I hope you're happy, Claire. You deserve that much." The words stung not because they were cruel, but because they were kind and final. They reminded me of everything I'd lost, everything I'd sacrificed to be here. Still, I knew there was no turning back now. Whatever guilt or regret I carried, I owed it to myself and to Leo to see this through. Late one night, unable to sleep, I wandered into the living room. Leo's guitar caught the moonlight streaming through the window, its curves soft and inviting. I reached out, tracing my fingers along its polished surface. For a moment, I imagined what it might feel like to start over completely, to erase the past and create something entirely new. But the truth was, I couldn't outrun it. Every decision I'd made, the affair leaving Richard, choosing Leo, had shaped me into the person sitting here now, staring at an instrument that represented so much more than music. As I stood there, lost in thought, Leo appeared in the doorway, his hair tousled from sleep. "What are you doing up?" he asked softly, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "Just thinking," I murmured, leaning into him despite the swirl of emotions inside me. "About everything," I admitted, though I didn't elaborate. How could I explain the tangled web of guilt, longing, and hope that lived within me? He kissed the top of my head, his embrace warm and grounding. "We'll figure it out," he said simply. "Together." For now, that would have to be enough. The rooftop was alive with the hum of distant city sounds, but above us, the sky erupted in bursts of color, fireworks painting streaks of gold and crimson across the night. I stood there, Leo's hand warm in mine as Manhattan stretched out before us like a glittering mosaic. For now, we were together, a fragile kind of happiness blooming between us, but the road ahead felt uncertain, shimmering with both promise and peril. As the explosions lit up the darkness, I couldn't help but think about everything it had taken to get here. The life I'd left behind, the vows I'd broken, the guilt that still lingered like smoke after a fire. Had I found true happiness? Or was this just the fleeting high of something new, built on rebellion and longing? The weight of my choices pressed down on me, heavy yet strangely freeing. Leo turned to me, his eyes reflecting the light from the sky. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly, squeezing my hand. I hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't come easily. How could I explain the swirl of emotions inside me? The hope tangled with fear, the joy shadowed by doubt. Instead, I smiled faintly and shook my head, just watching the fireworks. He didn't push further, and I was grateful. Some things didn't need to be said aloud. Not now, maybe not ever. As the final bursts faded into silence, leaving only the faint echo of explosions behind, I whispered to myself, barely audible over the city's pulse. Sometimes you have to burn down the old to build something new, but fire always leaves scars. The truth was, I didn't know if what we had would last. Maybe the scars would heal, maybe they'd fester. But standing there, holding Leo's hand under a sky still glowing with embers, I allowed myself to believe, for tonight, at least, that some risks were worth taking. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. Or so I hoped. Throughout this journey, I've wrestled with questions that have no easy answers, questions about love, loyalty, and the fragile line between desire and destruction. Can love exist outside societal norms, or is it inherently destructive when it defies expectations? With Leo, I found myself torn between the intoxicating pull of something real and the suffocating weight of judgment. Our connection wasn't just rebellion against my past. It was a spark of authenticity in a life I'd let grow stale. Yet every moment we shared came at a cost. Guilt over betraying Richard, fear of losing myself entirely. How do we reconcile our deepest desires with the consequences of pursuing them? That question haunted me late at night when the city fell silent, and all I could hear was the echo of choices made and paths abandoned. Choosing Leo meant stepping away from safety, from vows I once believed defined me. But staying with Richard would have meant sacrificing pieces of myself I wasn't ready to lose. The tension between what I wanted and what I owed others felt like walking a tightrope without a net. Rebuilding my life after such choices has been messy, painful, and uncertain. It's not just about moving forward. It's about facing the person I became along the way. There are days when shame lingers, whispering doubts about whether I'm worthy of happiness. But there are also moments when I see glimpses of redemption, not through perfection, but through courage. Courage to live authentically, even if it means facing uncertainty and judgment. This story isn't one of tidy resolutions or clear moral victories. It's an exploration of transformation, of learning to embrace imperfection while holding space for both regret and hope. Sometimes the greatest act of bravery isn't finding all the answers. It's choosing to keep going even when you don't.